Snow turned the street lamps into halos that winter night, light falling in soft cones onto sidewalks lined with frozen hedges, and the kind of silence that made even a ticking clock sound like a heartbeat under ice. On Elm Street, a door didn't quite close. It caught, trembled, and let the wind in with every small gust. The last person who touched it had stepped out without a coat. Her name was Clara Jennings, 23 years old, born and raised in a town that prided itself on never locking doors and knowing the name of every child who grew up inside its borders. At 7:46 p.m., on a night cold enough to crack window panes, Clara vanished between one porch light and the next. If you think time dulls the edges of heartbreak, stay with us, because this story proves the opposite, that some absences sharpen with age. And if stories like these matter to you, if you believe old mysteries deserve their answers, consider subscribing, because what happened that night in Illinois would remain unsolved for more than 6 decades, until science found a way to listen to what silence had kept. The house she left behind sat on a corner lot where the elm trees reached toward the power lines like old hands trying to pray. The steps were swept clean earlier that day, the kind of detail neighbors remembered later because it felt symbolic somehow. Inside, a radio hummed in the kitchen, its antenna bent, the announcer's voice flattened by static, as he listed high school basketball scores and a storm warning moving in from the west. Dinner dishes still steamed faintly on the table. 2 plates, 2 half-finished cups of coffee, and 1 chair slightly pushed back. On the wall, the kitchen clock read 7:41. The front hallway smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent. Clara's scarf, a thin red wool one her mother had knitted for her, hung neatly on the hook beside the back door. The scarf became the first clue, and for 50 years, the last. Neighbors would later say the night looked normal. Smoke rose from chimneys, the air brittle and dry. People stayed inside. But there were details that didn't fit. Dogs barking along the southern fence line, a car idling too long at the corner by the post office, and a porch light flicking on and off as if someone were testing whether it still worked. When the first phone call came from just a friend checking if Clara had made it home, no one was worried yet. Small towns are built on small reassurances. Maybe she stopped by her sister's place. Maybe she forgot her gloves and turned back. Maybe the snow slowed her down. At 8:15, when the second call came and the kitchen clock still hadn't moved from 7:41, worry took shape like frost spreading across a window pane. By 9, the sheriff's department had been notified. 2 deputies arrived, their boots knocking snow loose from the porch boards, their flashlights slicing through the white curtain that had settled over the street. Inside, the radio still played. The engine of a nearby car ticked as it cooled. The deputies found the door unlatched, no signs of struggle, and a trail of faint footprints leading down the walkway to the sidewalk, then turning right and ending halfway down the block. No drag marks, no other prints, just the kind of neat walking pattern made by someone who wasn't in a hurry until they suddenly were. At 10:30, the search began. Neighbors bundled in parkas, church volunteers carrying lanterns and flashlights, men from the mill in wool caps and gloves, and a line of light cutting through the snow. They called her name softly at first, then louder, as if the volume might undo whatever had already been done. Her father, Harold Jennings, led one group down toward the riverbank, the current hidden beneath a thin crust of ice. Her mother stayed in the kitchen with a blanket over her shoulders, staring at that red scarf on the hook, refusing to move it, refusing to let anyone take it as evidence because, she said, it's not evidence if she comes back. But she didn't. By midnight, the snow had thickened. The footprints were gone, and in that kind of weather, even echoes don't travel far. The sheriff wrote his first report at 12:17 a.m., his handwriting cramped and deliberate. Female, age 23. Last seen leaving residence. No signs of forced entry. Possible abduction. Weather, heavy snow, high winds. He underlined possible twice. He didn't know then that possible would become forgotten, and then decades later, solved. The following morning, the town woke to headlines in the local paper. Missing woman. Snowstorm hampers search. The editor had saved space for a second-day story. He would need it. By noon, more than 50 volunteers combed the outskirts of town. They checked every barn, every culvert, every frozen ditch. A farmer found a single glove 2 miles south. Gray wool, damp but intact. The sheriff logged it, bagged it, and wrote the word unknown, if relevant. Years later, when evidence boxes were cataloged for digital storage, the glove would still be there, sealed and waiting, its fibers holding onto a secret that no one yet knew could be read. That night, as the searchers returned, their boots leaving wet marks on the church steps, a deputy walked into the Jennings home and looked at the table again. 2 cups of coffee, now cold, both half full. He thought about pouring one out, then didn't. Instead, he straightened the chair that was still pulled back from the table. He couldn't say why. Maybe because the smallest act of order felt like a prayer in a room where the air had forgotten how to move. No one in town slept that night, and by the time the sun rose, every light in every window along Elm Street was still burning, as if illumination alone could keep the dark from remembering what it had already done. That was January 18th, 1957. The date would appear in 100 newspaper clippings, 3 official reports, and 1 family Bible, where Clara's mother eventually penciled beside her name. Missing. Not gone, not dead, just missing. Time would try to erase her. Snow melted, new tenants moved into the house, curtains changed, and a new family lived without knowing the history of the draft that crept through the back door. But the town never really forgot. People would still glance at the corner house when they passed, not because they expected to see her, but because it felt disrespectful not to. And somewhere buried in a cardboard box in an evidence room that hadn't been opened in decades, a fragment of her life still waited under tape and dust for a future that would know how to ask the right questions. The search began before dawn, when the cold made breath look like smoke and the snow under boots sounded like paper tearing. The sheriff gathered volunteers on the courthouse steps, farmers, mechanics, and high school boys still in their letterman jackets, and divided the map into quadrants drawn with a carpenter's pencil. They spread out in straight lines through the fields, shoulders nearly touching, flashlights bobbing like fireflies across the frozen ground. It was the kind of search that towns remember for decades, not because it found anything, but because it showed how far people will walk just to keep hope breathing. By noon, the light had turned gray, and the wind sharpened. The sleet came next, a fine hiss that erased the edges of footprints as fast as they were made. No torn fabric, no signs of a struggle. Just the white endlessness of Illinois farmland, and the sound of someone calling Clara's name over and over until their voice went hoarse. Inside the Jennings house, her mother sat near the stove, still wearing her church coat, refusing to move. The red scarf hung by the back door. When a deputy reached for it, thinking to collect it as evidence, she said, "That's hers. You don't take what's hers." Her husband stood silent at the sink, staring out at the empty yard. Every few minutes, he wiped the same clean spot on the counter, as though waiting for something to fill it. Sheriff Harold Dean, a broad man with hands rough from farm work, had seen disappearances before. Drunks who wandered off, teenagers who left notes on kitchen tables. But this felt different. Clara was steady and polite, the kind of young woman who volunteered at church suppers and wrote thank you notes on stationery. There was no argument, no debt, and no lover waiting in the shadows. Just stillness. By the second day, reporters from Springfield and Chicago had arrived, their cars leaving wet tire tracks through town. They filled the diner on Main Street, asking the same questions to anyone who would answer. Has anyone seen a car parked near Elm Street? A man in a dark coat? A sound in the snow? The locals wanted to help, but didn't have answers, only guesses. A neighbor swore she'd heard an engine idling near the post office. Another said she'd seen a shape by the river, maybe a deer. The sheriff wrote it all down and underlined nothing. That afternoon, bloodhounds from Peoria were brought in. They caught a scent near the bridge but lost it 50 yards later, circling, confused. The sheriff drew a small X on his map and wrote, "Scent lost near River Bend." He would make many of those X's in the weeks ahead. Night turned the town into a blur of lantern light and frozen fences. Volunteers searched until frost crusted their eyelashes. At the church, women poured coffee into paper cups and whispered prayers into the steam. The sheriff's logbook was filled with dates and temperatures, but fewer and fewer notes about leads. The words, "no result," began to appear at the end of every entry. 3 days later, a farmer's son found something at the edge of his field. A compact mirror half buried in snow. The glass was cracked but still reflected the gray sky. On the back, 2 initials were engraved. C.J. The sheriff sealed it in a paper envelope marked Item 3. The state lab returned it weeks later with a typewritten note. No identifiable prints. No foreign matter found. The mirror was placed in a cardboard box and forgotten. But decades later, that mirror would prove what time itself had failed to erase. That truth can survive if it's patient enough. As January turned to February, the search lines grew thinner. The snow melted into mud, and the volunteers stopped showing up. The sheriff went out alone some nights, driving the county roads with his headlights off until the stars lit his windshield. He would park near the Jennings farm, step into the cold, and listen. There is a kind of silence that answers back. 6 weeks later, the town held a memorial service at the Methodist church. There was no casket, only a framed photograph of Clara on the altar and her red scarf folded beside it. Her mother clutched the scarf throughout the sermon, knuckles white. The pastor said that sometimes faith means believing in what isn't found. People nodded, because what else could they do? After that, the file began to gather dust. Leads grew colder than the winter that started it. A new sheriff took office in 1964. The case passed to him with a dozen others, and he filed it under unsolved. When Clara's parents died, the house on Elm Street was sold. The new owners repainted, replaced the floors, and mentioned once to a neighbor that the back door never stopped letting in a draft. By 1980, the case was folklore. Children dared each other to walk past the corner house at night. Adults avoided the topic altogether. The name Clara Jennings became shorthand for the unspeakable, the kind of story parents used when they wanted their daughters home before dark. Then, in 2007, during an evidence digitization project, a clerk found the box again. The label had faded, the tape brittle. Inside were the mirror, the red scarf, and a small glass vial containing a single dark hair. The note inside, typed in 1957, read, "Specimen. A recovered from doorframe, interior kitchen." Sheriff David Collier, new to the department, read the file while waiting for the scanner to warm up. He noticed that under DNA analysis, the field was blank. "That's from before DNA," a technician explained. Collier nodded, but he didn't close the folder. He drafted a short memo to the state lab in Springfield. "Please evaluate the possibility of testing the historical sample from case 57 to 014. 2 weeks later, a young forensic analyst opened the old vial. The seal cracked like a sigh. Inside, the strand of hair looked ordinarily dark, fine, and human, but to her, it was a voice trapped in glass. She placed it under magnification, extracted a single cell from the root, and loaded it into a sequencer. The machine hummed softly, a heartbeat of circuits and light. On her monitor, a blue progress bar crept forward. 10%, 45%, 88%. Then the word appeared, match pending. In a town that had learned to stop expecting answers, the past had just cleared its throat. 50 years after Clara Jennings vanished into the snow, her story had begun to speak again. The alert came quietly. Just a line of text on a lab monitor in Springfield. Match found. Familial link detected. It was February 2008, 51 years after Clara Jennings vanished. The analyst, Rebecca Monroe, stared at the screen in disbelief. DNA, pulled from that single strand of hair, had found a living connection, a Latimer, somewhere in Illinois. She double-checked the data, then called Dawson County. Sheriff David Collier listened as she explained the result. A familial hit, likely a close relative of whoever left the sample at Clara's house. When he hung up, he just stared at the old file spread across his desk. The last page was dated 1959. He crossed out the words, "File closed," and wrote, "Were opened pending verification." The Latimer name wasn't new. Collier found it twice in the original 1957 notes. Frank A. Latimer, age 32, lived 3 houses down from the Jennings family, worked at the grain elevator, and was described as cooperative. His statement had been brief. Heard nothing unusual. The sheriff from back then hadn't followed up. Collier found Frank's obituary in the microfilm archives. Died 1994. Survived by wife Evelyn and one son, Richard, then in his 20s. Collier had seen too many good neighbor obituaries to take them at face value. The DNA match connected to Richard. The probability was over 99%. It meant one thing. Whoever had left that hair had been in Frank Latimer's direct bloodline. Collier and his deputy, Maria Alvarez, drove out to Vandalia. The road cut through frozen fields and bare trees that looked like black veins against a pale sky. Richard Latimer's house sat at the edge of town, tidy and quiet. When he opened the door, he looked older than his years, tired, like someone who'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. "Your father's name came up in an old case," Collier said. "Clara Jennings." Richard nodded slowly. "He mentioned her once. She said she never made it home, told me not to ask questions." He agreed to a DNA swab without protest. As the technician packed up, he looked out the window toward the cornfields and said, "He was a decent man to everyone but himself." You grow up thinking silence means peace. Then one day you realize it just means someone's hiding something. A week later, the lab confirmed it. The hair recovered from Clara's kitchen doorframe was a perfect match to Frank Latimer. With that, the Jennings case shifted from missing to homicide. The puzzle began to rearrange itself. Latimer had been questioned in 1957 but never cleared. His alibi of being home with his wife by 9 p.m. had come solely from her. The report noted that he returned covered in snow, something no one had thought suspicious then. Evelyn Latimer had died years earlier, but her statement remained in the file like a quiet ghost. The Latimer house was long gone, torn down in the late 70s to make room for a feed store. But Collier, following a hunch, requested a ground scan of the property. Beneath a slab of poured concrete where the backyard once stood, the radar picked up irregular shapes and dense pockets in the soil. 2 weeks later, a state forensics team uncovered the remains of a woman buried in a shallow depression beneath what had once been the old well. Alongside the bones lay scraps of blue fabric and a broken compact mirror. Dental records confirmed it within 48 hours. Clara Jennings, missing since 1957. The news traveled fast. DNA solves 51-year cold case, read the headlines. Neighbors who had once searched for her stood on their porches with papers folded in their hands, murmuring her name for the first time in decades. Sheriff Collier didn't celebrate. He just sat at his desk that night, the snow falling outside like it had the night she disappeared, and wrote a single line in his report. After 51 years, Clara Jennings has been found. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The recovery site stayed cordoned off for 3 days while the forensic team worked. Floodlights cast pale circles over the concrete slab and the soft, churned earth beneath it. Each shovelful came up darker than the last, until the outline of the grave was unmistakable, a narrow oval about 5 feet long. Inside, the soil had compacted around fragments of fabric and bone, sealed tight by frost and decades of silence. When they lifted the remains, They found the small brass clasp of a purse and a set of keys fused together with rust. On one keychain was a single-letter charm, C. The sheriff stood a few feet back, his breath showing in the cold. He didn't speak until the coroner confirmed what everyone already knew. Then he nodded once and said quietly, "Let's take her home." By morning, the story was everywhere. 1957. Cold case cracked by DNA. Remains found beneath former neighbor's property. News vans lined the feed store lot, and for the first time in decades, Elm Street filled with strangers holding cameras. People who had grown up with Clara's name in whispered tones now saw it printed bold on TV screens. Some were relieved. Others wished the quiet had been left undisturbed. Inside the sheriff's office, Collier spread the evidence across a table: photographs, statements, the recovered items, and a copy of Frank Latimer's old employment records. The motive, he knew, would decide whether this ended as a confession or a mystery that simply stopped moving. He read and reread the 1957 interviews. One neighbor, an older widow named Pauline Mercer, had told deputies she'd seen Clara speaking with someone near the grain elevator 2 days before she disappeared. She couldn't name the man, but she remembered his hat, a gray felt one with a dented brim. Latimer wore one daily. It was in his portrait on the obituary clipping. A call to the grain company archives showed that Clara had been handling clerical work for them part-time that winter. Payroll forms revealed something no one had noticed before. One of the checks she signed had Latimer's initials beside hers. She'd been helping to process employee time cards, and one of those time cards had been marked for overtime on the very night she disappeared. Collier leaned back, the chain of events settling into place like old gears finding alignment. Whatever happened that night had started as a work-related, familiar, perhaps just an argument that escalated into something irreversible. The rest had been panic, burial, and silence. The bones told part of the story. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a blow from a heavy object, possibly a tool. A fracture ran along the parietal bone, clean and fatal. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. She might have never seen it coming. When Collier visited the lab to collect the final reports, the analyst handed him the compact mirror. Its cracked glass had been cleaned. The initials still shone faintly under fluorescent light. "You know," she said, "the powder residue inside still carries traces of her skin oil. It's like she's been waiting here the whole time." He nodded. She waited long enough. Back in Dawson County, the sheriff met again with Richard Latimer. They sat across from each other in a small interview room that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Richard had already heard the news. He'd seen the coverage, the pictures of the excavation. He looked older, worn thin, by a guilt that wasn't entirely his. "Did your father ever mention Clara again after that one time?" Collier asked. Richard shook his head. He didn't have to. The silence did the talking. Mom used to flinch when that name came on the radio, even if it was someone else. I asked her once, years later. She said there are truths that can't be spoken without unmaking a family. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "This was in Dad's toolbox after he died. I never knew what it was until now." Collier unfolded the paper. Inside was a silver watch chain, worn smooth. The clasp was engraved with a single letter, J. Jennings, Collier said quietly. Richard nodded. "I think he kept it as a reminder, or a punishment." It was enough. The chain joined the other evidence in an envelope marked, "Recovered 2008 confession by proxy." The case officially closed that April, more than half a century after it began. There were no arrests to make. Frank Latimer had been dead 14 years. But closure, imperfect as it was, came to Elm Street. The sheriff held a small press conference on the courthouse steps, flanked by a framed photo of Clara smiling in a polka-dot dress. He spoke plainly, with no dramatics and no self-congratulation. "This isn't about reopening wounds," he said. It's about giving one family back what was taken from them, the truth. The town gathered at the cemetery that weekend for a reburial. Snow still clung to the grass in patches, soft and melting. A new headstone was placed beside her parents' plot. Clara Jennings, 1934, 1957, brought home at last. The pastor said a few words about patience and the way time bends to those who refuse to forget. When it was over, the crowd thinned until only the sheriff and a few townspeople remained. One of them, an elderly woman in a gray coat, lingered at the edge of the grave. She had been a child in 1957, the one who'd found the compact mirror in her father's field. She placed a single sunflower against the stone and whispered, "You can rest now." Later that evening, Collier drove down Elm Street one last time. The houses looked different, smaller somehow, but the wind still found the same cracks between fences. He parked near the corner where Clara's old home once stood, and watched as the porch light flickered on automatically, just another timer switch, unaware of history. 51 winters had passed between that night and this one. For the first time since 1957, the town slept without wondering. The red scarf, washed, mended, and faded, hung in the local museum behind glass now, a quiet monument to persistence. And for Sheriff Collier, as he closed the file for the final time, it was less about victory than about something simpler, quieter. Not justice, not even redemption, just the long overdue exhale of a story that had been holding its breath for half a century. The Jennings case file, once the thickest binder in the Dawson County archives, sat now in a glass display at the courthouse. A brass plaque beneath it read, "Closed 2008, identified by DNA." But for Sheriff Collier, it didn't feel finished. He still found himself revisiting the details. Late nights, desk lamp humming, snow ticking against the window. The facts fit. Yes. The timeline held. But something about it wouldn't settle. Motive, he told himself, is the heartbeat of every case. And this one still felt faint. He went back to the 1957 interviews again, reading them slowly this time, letting the silences between sentences do their work. Clara's last day had been an ordinary one. A bank deposit, a stop at the grain office, and a short walk home. Somewhere in those final minutes, Frank Latimer appeared. But why? It was the payroll documents that started to speak first. In them, Collier found an irregularity. A check from the grain company issued under Clara's signature to F.A. Latimer overtime hours. The time entry matched the night she vanished. When the sheriff contacted the company's successor firm, he learned that no overtime had been logged that week. Forgery. And perhaps confrontation. Clara, meticulous and honest, had likely caught it. The conversation might have been sharp. One accusation, one denial, one angry moment, and then a blow. Still, Collier wanted confirmation. So he tracked down anyone still alive who'd worked at the grain office that winter. He found one, Harold Kemp, 92, living in a nursing home near Decatur. When Collier asked if he remembered the Jennings girl, the old man smiled faintly. "Polite, but strict," he said. "Wouldn't let a decimal go astray. She kept books tighter than the manager himself." "Do you remember Frank Latimer?" Kemp's eyes clouded for a moment. "Sure. Quiet fella. Drank at Miller's Tavern after shifts. He always said the company owed him for hours he never got paid. I told him to take it up with management, but he said he'd found a way to settle the balance himself. I figured he meant another job. Maybe not." That word "settle" lodged in Collier's mind. He'd heard it before, written in Clara's diary entries preserved in the file. In one, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, she'd scribbled a line, "Some debts never stay on paper. Some men don't like being told no." That was enough for the sheriff to reconstruct the likely sequence. Clara found the falsified time card. She confronted Latimer, perhaps in the station office after closing. The argument turned violent. He struck her, panicked, and hid the body under his property. Later, he falsified her final paycheck to mask the theft. When the town searched, he joined them, shoulder to shoulder with her parents, feigning concern. And then he simply lived 40 more years under that same sky, mowing the same lawn above her grave. The coroner's final report came through in March 2008. Cause of death: cranial fracture from blunt impact. Estimated time: between 6:30 and 7 p.m. Temperature data from that night confirmed the snowstorm began shortly after. If true, then the killer had worked fast, burying her before the ground froze, sealing her fate beneath the first snowfall. In April, Collier presented his findings to the state attorney's office. There would be no trial. The suspect was long dead, but he insisted on an official statement of guilt to close the historical record. It took weeks of paperwork, testimony, and archived documentation. Finally, the Illinois State Police issued the verdict. Case resolved. Perpetrator identified posthumously. News crews returned to Elm Street. Gray-haired residents spoke to microphones, their voices soft with disbelief. "He lived right here," one man said, pointing toward the old feedlot. "I used to borrow his shovel after big storms." For Clara's relatives, distant cousins scattered across the Midwest, it was a strange kind of closure. One came to the courthouse, a woman in her 60s who'd grown up hearing the story. "My mother used to light a candle for her every year," she told reporters. "Now I guess we can stop wondering if the world ever knew what it did to her." When the attention faded, Collier drove out to the property one last time. The excavation pit had been filled, the concrete repoured, and the feed store trucks once again parked where her body had been found. He stood there in the afternoon light, the hum of engines and the scent of diesel in the air, and tried to imagine the same ground 50 years earlier. Quiet, snow still falling, a man covering what he could not face. He thought of Richard Latimer, who had answered every question with calm honesty, a son who had inherited a secret he never asked for. Collier had sent him the official closure notice by mail, but Richard had never replied. Some things, the sheriff supposed, were too heavy for words. That spring, Clara's story became part of the curriculum at the local high school, a case study in forensic science and perseverance. Students toured the museum display, where her red scarf hung beside the lab photo of the hair strand that had solved everything. Beneath it, a small card read, "Preserved evidence, collected in 1957, DNA profile extracted in 2008, proof that even time leaves fingerprints." For Collier, the file's final page was a single paragraph, typed in his slow, deliberate hand. "In this job, you learn that truth is rarely loud. Sometimes it waits in silence under floorboards, under snow, under concrete. All it takes is one person who refuses to stop asking." He placed that page in the front of the binder before sealing it for good. Then he locked the cabinet and turned off the light. The courthouse clock struck 6, and outside, dusk slid over the fields. It was the same kind of evening Clara had walked through all those years ago, cold, pale, unassuming. Somewhere, far from the courthouse, a train whistle sounded a lonely thread through the quiet, and in that sound, Collier heard not victory, but acknowledgement. A reminder that every truth, no matter how long buried, still moves through the world looking for someone willing to listen. The case had been closed on paper, but stories like Clara's never really ended. They just folded into the quiet fabric of the town. Months after the press conference, when the reporters were gone and the courthouse lights dimmed again, Dawson County felt almost normal. But in small towns, memory doesn't die with the headlines. It lingers, whispered in grocery aisles and over coffee counters, reshaping itself with every retelling. For Sheriff Collier, that was the hardest part. The way truth turned into folklore so quickly. A year after the discovery, he found himself driving down Elm Street again, out of habit more than duty. The winter air was thin, the fields white to the horizon. He parked near what used to be the Latimer property and sat with the engine idling, watching the breath of his own truck fog the windshield. The feed store was still open. Workers moved in and out with forklifts and grain sacks, unaware of the grave their tires passed over daily. He got out, boots crunching through frost, and walked the perimeter. The slab where they'd unearthed Clara lay smooth and featureless now. No markers, no sign that anything sacred or horrific had ever lived beneath it. Just poured concrete, pale and indifferent. Collier stood there until his fingers went numb. The cold made the world so quiet he could hear his pulse in his ears. Then he whispered, mostly to himself, "She's home now," and left. That spring, he received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed on an old manual machine. The paper smelled faintly of oil and dust. "Sheriff, you gave her back her name. That matters. Some of us knew things but said nothing. Fear makes cowards of everyone. I hope you know that silence wasn't all evil. Sometimes it's just people trying to survive what they can't undo." A neighbor. No signature. Collier stared at the note for a long time before folding it into the file. He didn't chase the writer down. He didn't need to. Whoever had written it had been living with the same ghost he'd just laid to rest. Summer came. The museum curator called to tell him the exhibit was drawing steady visitors, mostly high school classes and retirees who remembered the case. They'd added a small plaque beside the red scarf. Recovered in 1957. Returned in 2008. Proof that time remembers what people forget. When Collier visited, he watched from the corner as a group of students clustered around the display. One of them, a girl no older than 16, pointed at the photo of Clara and said softly, "She looks like someone who thought she had forever." None of them noticed the sheriff standing nearby. That was how he preferred it. Later, he met with the county historian, who was cataloging the case materials for state preservation. The man, a professor type, with wireframe glasses and ink-stained fingers, asked Collier how it felt to solve history. The sheriff smiled faintly and said, "History doesn't get solved. It just stops bleeding." By autumn, Collier was easing toward retirement. 32 years in uniform, and this case would be the one to follow him home. The town threw him a small gathering at the VFW hall with cake, coffee, and polite speeches. Near the end, a woman approached him quietly. Mid-70s, white hair pinned back, steady hands. "You don't know me," she said. "But I lived across from Clara back then. My mother used to send me over with apples from our tree. I always wondered if she'd been found. Thank you for answering that question before I went." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she left, he noticed she'd slipped something onto the table beside his coffee cup, a pressed daisy flattened between glass, the kind of flower Clara might have kept in a book. That night, alone in his office, he opened the window to let in the cold air and reread his final report. He'd ended it with a single line: "Truth survives in the smallest things." It felt right. In November, he drove to Springfield one last time to deliver the sealed files to the state archive. The archivist, a woman younger than his badge, thanked him for preserving the chain of custody. As she signed the receipt, she asked if this was closure. Collier looked at the labeled box, "Jennings, Clara, 19th, 57-2008, and said, "Closure's a word for lawyers. This is just peace." The highway home was long and flat, the kind that blurs into itself until you forget how far you've gone. He passed the old railway line that had once carried Latimer's grain shipments, now rusted and overgrown with weeds. The fields were bare again, dusted with frost. When he reached the county line, the radio played an old tune, something from the 50s, soft and sentimental. He let it play, though he'd never cared for oldies. The lyrics, faint but clear, spoke of distance and return. He thought of Clara walking that road home, unaware of what waited for her 3 houses down. He thought of her parents, who'd died, never knowing. And then, finally, he thought of the hair, one fragile strand that refused to disappear, surviving fire, water, and decades of storage, and still carrying her story inside it. That was the miracle of the case, he realized. Not that science had caught a killer, but that something so small, so ordinary, had remembered her when no one else could. He parked at the courthouse, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. Outside, the streetlights hummed. Across town, the museum lights would be shutting off soon, the scarf folding back into shadow behind glass. Somewhere, the first snow of the season melted against his windshield. 51 winters had come and gone since the night Clara Jennings disappeared. But this one, at last, belonged to her. Winter settled early that year, coating the Illinois plains in a thin sheet of white that seemed to muffle every sound. For the first time in decades, the courthouse bell rang through that silence without echoing the weight of an unfinished story. But for those who had lived under Clara's absence, the quiet didn't feel like relief. It felt like an adjustment, a pause between the old ache and something resembling peace. Sheriff Collier had retired by then. His badge sat in a drawer beside a stack of unsent letters, most addressed to families from other unsolved cases. People he'd promised, and failed, to bring closure to. But the Jennings file had changed him. It had shown him that sometimes justice isn't a gavel or a cell. Sometimes it's the return of a name to the living, even if the dead can no longer speak. In January 2009, he was invited to give a short talk at the county high school for a civic history program. He didn't want to. He'd never liked microphones, or the way crowds looked when waiting for something profound. But he went anyway, wearing his best jacket, the one his wife used to press before community events. The students were younger than the case by half a century. None of them knew the fear that had crept through their grandparents' kitchens in 1957. They didn't remember the curfews or the porch lights that never went dark for months. But when Collier told the story, the version he'd pieced together through evidence, interviews, and memory, they listened as if the past still had breath. He spoke without notes. He described the snowstorm, the red scarf, the silence that settled over the town, and the hair that waited half a lifetime to speak. He left out the blood, the details of the wound, and the ugliness of panic. He focused instead on endurance. At the end, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "If it took 50 years to solve," she asked, "was it even worth it?" Collier smiled gently. "Every truth that's buried is like a stone in the shoe of a whole town. It slows everyone down until someone finally bends to take it out. That's worth the time it takes." Afterward, one of the teachers handed him a photograph, an old black and white copy of a class picture from 1957. A name was written on the back, in blue ink. Clara Jennings, age 22, volunteer secretary, county fair. The image showed a young woman standing at the edge of a group, smiling but half turned toward something outside the frame, like she already sensed the moment wouldn't hold her for long. That photo ended up in Collier's home office, propped against a stack of case files he never reopened. It became a quiet reminder that every story, no matter how old, deserves to be looked at one more time. Meanwhile, the town changed. The old feed store that had once stood over her grave closed for good in 2012. The building was torn down and replaced with a small public park, with oak benches, a swing set, and a single plaque near the entrance. It read simply, "In memory of all who waited for answers. Estimated 2012. Children played there in summers, their laughter drifting across the same ground where search parties had once trudged through snow." The townsfolk didn't talk about it much anymore. But when someone did, when an out-of-towner asked about the girl in the scarf, people lowered their voices, softened their tone, and told it like folklore. Not a murder, a lesson. The museum curator, Anna Mercer, became something of a guardian for Clara's story. She polished the glass case once a week, dusted the scarf, and changed the wilted flowers visitors left beside it. On the 10th anniversary of the case closure, she organized a small candlelight vigil. Only 14 people came. Teachers, a retired deputy, and 2 of Clara's distant cousins were there. But the air was thick with the kind of stillness that felt deliberate, sacred even. Anna lit the first candle and said, "Some stories end in courtrooms. Others end in understanding. This one gave us both." The candles flickered in the glass reflection, their light mirrored in the photo of the scarf's fibers magnified under a microscope. A reminder that something invisible had carried the truth across generations. After the vigil, Collier stayed behind, while the others drifted away into the winter dark. He traced the edge of the display case with his fingertips and thought about what time does to guilt, to grief, to memory. He didn't feel triumph, just gravity. Before leaving, he signed the guest book by the door. He wrote his name small, almost hesitant, and beneath it, 5 words that seemed to carry the whole of what he believed. Justice is patient. Truth is tireless. When he stepped outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the bare trees, stirring loose flakes of snow from their branches. Across the street, the courthouse windows glowed pale yellow, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Years later, when Collier passed away quietly in his sleep, the town paper ran a short obituary. It didn't mention medals or years of service. It mentioned only one case, the one that had refused to be forgotten. And so the story continued its quiet work, not through fear anymore, but through remembrance. The Jennings name became shorthand for endurance in the face of silence. Teachers told it to new students. Local papers ran anniversary pieces each December. And every year, when the snow began to fall, someone left a single red scarf draped over the park bench near where the feed store used to stand. No one ever claimed credit. No one needed to. It was enough to know that, half a century after she walked out into that winter night, Clara Jennings still came home with every snowfall. By the time the 12th winter came after the case had been solved, the story of Clara Jennings had become part of the town's rhythm, something unspoken yet ever-present, like the way everyone still left their porch lights on longer than they needed to, once the days shortened. There wasn't fear anymore, just memory woven so tightly into the landscape that no one could separate the town from what it had endured. The park where her remains had been found was quiet most of the year. Kids played there through spring and summer, their laughter echoing where the old grain elevator had once stood. But when the cold returned, it changed. In December, someone always tied a red ribbon around the oak at the center of the park. No one ever saw who did it, and no one ever removed it. The ribbon just faded over time, bright at first, then pink, then ghost white by spring. The town council had renamed the space Jennings Grove in 2015. A simple bronze plaque near the path read, "Dedicated to the persistence of truth and to the people who never stopped looking." It wasn't much, but in small towns, reverence lives in understatement. Former Sheriff Collier's widow, Elaine, visited often after his passing. She'd bring a thermos of coffee, sit on the same bench every Wednesday, and watch the light shift through the trees. People greeted her quietly when they passed, some leaving flowers, others just a nod. Once, a young man, one of the high school students who'd heard Collier's talk years before, approached her. "Your husband made people believe again," he said. She smiled, not sure what to do with words like that, and offered him a cup of coffee. That spring, the county courthouse installed a new exhibit, Unsolved to Solved, the evolution of forensic science. At its center was a glass case, labeled The Jennings Breakthrough, 1957 and 2008. Inside sat the red scarf, the compact mirror, and a fragment of the report showing the DNA sequence that had identified Frank Latimer. A small plaque read, "Objects carry memory, and memory carries justice." School groups toured the exhibit, their teachers explaining how one tiny biological trace, a single cell, had spoken after half a century of silence. For most of the students, it was science fiction turned real. For the older visitors, it was something deeper, proof that persistence, in the right hands, could rewrite the end of a story. Years moved differently in Dawson County after that. The town was quieter, but not in the haunted way it used to be. People had stopped looking over their shoulders at night, But they hadn't stopped looking back. There was a kind of gratitude in the remembering. Each January, on the anniversary of Clara's disappearance, someone from the museum placed a fresh red scarf in the display window facing Elm Street, visible to every passing car. In 2020, a documentary crew arrived to film a segment for a series on cold cases cracked by DNA. They interviewed retired deputies, townspeople, and one of the lab technicians who had processed the evidence years earlier. In the final cut, the film ended with a slow pan over the snow-covered park, with a voiceover reading Collier's final report. Truth is patient. It waits under floorboards, under soil, under silence. It waits for hands willing to listen. When the film aired, it reached beyond Illinois. Letters began arriving at the county office from people across the country, families with their own unsolved stories, writing to say that Clara's case gave them hope. Some included photographs of missing relatives, and some just words like, "Thank you," or "Please don't stop." The archivist kept them all in a folder labeled Letters to the Past. That summer, the museum held a public reading of those letters. It was a warm evening, the kind where cicadas drowned out everything but the voices of the speakers. Elaine attended, sitting in the front row. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 40 people, but it felt like the entire town was there in spirit. Each letter was read aloud by a volunteer. Some were about mothers, others about brothers, and one about a girl missing since 1974. When they finished, Elaine stood and said softly, "What connects all of them is faith that the truth never forgets its way home." Afterward, the curator placed the letters in the same display case as Clara's scarf, not as exhibits, but as companions. Evidence of what her story had left behind was a reminder that one solved case can light the path for countless others still in the dark. That night, a light snow began to fall. Thin, windless, steady. Elaine walked home slowly, her breath a small cloud before her. As she passed Jennings Grove, she noticed that the red ribbon around the oak had been replaced again, brighter this time, tied in a perfect bow. There was something comforting about its persistence, the way it appeared every year as if time itself insisted on remembering. In the morning, the local paper ran a short editorial under the headline, "The Town That Kept Its Promise." The last line read, "Justice isn't a moment. It's a memory, kept alive long enough to be heard." And so the story endured, quiet but alive, carried forward by people who refused to let it fade. For every child who played under that oak, for every visitor who paused at the courthouse exhibit, and for every family still waiting for their own phone call from a DNA lab, Clara's name remained an answer, not just to what was lost, but to what can still be found when truth is given time. By 2024, nearly 70 years after that cold night in 1957, the Jennings case had become something beyond history. It had become the town's conscience. What began as tragedy had turned into ritual, the kind of story that people passed down like an inherited truth. The museum exhibit still drew quiet visitors each week, and the park ribbon still appeared every December. It no longer mattered who tied it. In a place where silence had once buried everything, small gestures had become their own form of prayer. The county installed a digital archive that spring, a searchable database of every missing person in Illinois from the mid-century forward. The Jennings file was placed first in the sequence. The project's coordinator, a graduate student named Daniel Perez, called it an act of preservation against forgetting. When asked why he'd chosen Clara's case to open the archive, he said, "Because it reminds people that technology didn't solve this alone. People did. People who refused to stop asking." He wasn't wrong. Behind every lab test and every computer scan had been some hands shaking, some patient turning pages, bagging evidence, and tracing old signatures. And at the heart of it all was that single strand of hair. It had survived moisture, dust, and decades of neglect, clinging to a doorway as if it knew it still had work to do. When students visited the museum now, The curator sometimes showed them a magnified image of it, suspended in glass, like a thread of light. That, she'd say, is what persistence looks like. The Jennings Grove Community Group continued its work too, organizing searches for newer cases and raising funds for cold case testing in nearby counties. One of their campaigns helped reopen an investigation from 1972 that had sat dormant for 50 years. They called it the Clara Effect. The name caught on statewide, even showing up in a small news segment about grassroots forensic fundraising. Clara Jennings, a name once written on a missing poster, had become a symbol of endurance. Elaine Collier, now well into her 70s, kept her weekly visits to the park. She had grown frail, but her routine never changed. She'd sit with her thermos, pour a small cup, and watch the morning light fall over the plaque. Sometimes she'd talk aloud to her late husband, as though he were sitting beside her. The groundskeeper once overheard her say, "You were right, David. Truth doesn't die. It just waits for someone patient enough to listen." In the autumn of that year, a traveling exhibit from the State Museum borrowed several pieces from the Jennings case. The scarf, the compact mirror, and even the old typewritten letters from the 50s investigation. They displayed them under the banner "Evidence of Memory" and sent them across the Midwest. In each city, visitors would stop at the final panel, where a photograph of the Dawson County Park hung beside Collier's handwritten line, "Truth survives in the smallest things." Somewhere between Chicago and Street Louis, a middle-aged woman left a note in the comment box beneath that photo. It read, "My aunt vanished in 1963. We still don't know what happened, but this story reminds me to keep her picture by the window, just in case she's still finding her way home." The note was forwarded to the Dawson County Museum and added to the growing Letters to the Past collection. It joined hundreds of other messages from strangers, connected not by blood, but by longing, by the shared belief that time doesn't erase what matters. When winter came again, snow blanketed the park so deeply that for weeks the benches disappeared beneath it. Still, the ribbon appeared. This time 2 of them, side by side, swaying slightly in the wind. One bright red, one pale as bone. The sight drew a few quiet onlookers that morning. A boy asked his mother what it meant. She thought for a moment, then said, "It means someone remembered." Later that evening, the museum hosted its annual Remembrance Night. The hall lights were low, candles lined the floor, and the air smelled faintly of cedar from the display cases. The curator began with her usual welcome, then invited visitors to write a single sentence on cards provided at the entrance. One truth they'd learned from the Jennings story. The cards were collected and read aloud, each one a small echo of the others. That every secret leaves a trace. That grief and truth can share the same room. That justice has no expiration date. When the last candle flickered out, the room stayed silent for a long time. No applause, no music. Just the soft hum of the heating vent and the awareness that everyone present had carried something unspoken into that space. Outside, the snow continued to fall, steady, fine, and endless. From the museum steps, you could see the courthouse clock glowing faintly across town, and, just beyond it, the line of trees where Jennings Grove stood. For a moment, under the streetlight, the falling snow looked like the static of an old film reel, as if the past were still playing somewhere in the air. And maybe it was, because in the end, Clara's story wasn't about death or discovery. It was about endurance, about how a name can travel through silence and come back changed, carrying light where darkness had lived too long. If you've followed this story, if you believe that remembering matters, and that every unanswered question deserves one more look, then stay with us. There are more stories waiting beneath the surface, more names still whispering from forgotten files. Subscribe to join us for the next investigation, because some truths, no matter how long they wait, are still waiting to be found. Spring came back to Dawson County, soft and forgiving. The fields turned green again, the courthouse clock chimed steadily, and life returned. to its quiet rhythm. Yet the memory of Clara Jennings remained woven through the town like the grain lines in old wood, subtle but permanent. At the museum, the display case had changed slightly. The red scarf rested in preservation storage, replaced for now by the silver locket found near Clara's remains. A small plaque beneath it read, "The truth waits for those who listen." People still came. Teachers with their classes, couples passing through, and families who'd lost someone once. They stood silently, reading, remembering. Outside, the oak tree in Jennings Grove towered higher than ever, its roots anchored deep in the same soil that had once hidden her. Every winter, ribbons appeared again, always red, sometimes white, sometimes two at once, fluttering together in the cold air. No one knew who tied them. No one ever saw. That year, the county placed a simple granite stone beneath the tree. It bore the words from Sheriff Collier's notes. Truth doesn't move fast, but it never stops walking. During the small dedication ceremony, the crowd stood in silence. No speeches, no applause, just the wind moving through branches that had watched nearly 70 winters pass. After the ceremony, Elaine Collier placed the silver locket at the base of the stone, her hands trembling in the light. "She belongs here," she whispered. "So does the truth." When dusk fell, the park emptied. The last sunlight caught the locket's edge, turning it briefly to fire before fading. And by the time darkness settled over Dawson County, one more ribbon had appeared bright red against the gray bark, swaying like a heartbeat that refused to stop. If this story reminds you that truth endures and that every name lost to time deserves to be found, then stay with us. Subscribe for more investigations where patience brings the forgotten home.